All right, folks, let's settle down and gather round our listening devices. It is time for Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. Thanks so much for tuning into the program. We've got a great conversation to share with you today. My guest today is Henry Maar. Henry is an American historian. He got his PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara, a school I know very well and have spoken about many times on this program. I want to talk to Henry about his book, though. His book is awesome, and I suggest everyone check it out. It's called Freeze, the Grassroots Movement to Halt the Arms Race and End the Cold War. This book takes on the organized resistance to the American government's pursuit of nuclear war in the early 1980s under the guidance of the psychotic Ronald Reagan. But we also talk about in this conversation the movie The Day After. We think about it in the context of the Leonardo DiCaprio film Don't Look Up, another film that tries to create a hysteria about climate change. I think The Day After did a better job of creating hysteria about nuclear war. But either way, there was an atmosphere of dread in the early 1980s about nuclear war and nuclear bombs. I don't remember that early element of it, but I certainly was raised around during the time of Ronald Reagan being president. I was a little kid, and I remember nuclear bombs being part of the cultural landscape for sure. So we get into that, and we get into this idea of like how ordinary people can do anything about that. And actually, what Henry uncovers in his book in great detail from a lot of archival research from the Reagan administration itself is that the Reagan administration was very, very concerned about the nuclear freeze movement, and that anti-nuclear activists actually were on the minds of Reagan officials, Reagan administration officials, as they figured out how to navigate the Cold War and navigate their relationship to the Soviet Union. It's really, really fascinating stuff. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and I hope you enjoy all our Nostalgia Trap stuff. We've got a lot more for you on our Patreon. We have basically 8 years of material that you can gain access to for literally $5. We're giving this stuff away. If you do the math, I mean, that's a pretty good deal. So at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, go over there and subscribe if you like our stuff, because I think some of our juiciest episodes, including all of our stuff with Justin Rogers Cooper and Yasmin Nair and KJ Shepard and a bunch of other really, really great stars of our program are over there. So go check out the Patreon, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We've got a lot of great stuff coming out throughout this year for our subscribers. Thanks so much, and enjoy this conversation. Here is me speaking with Henry Maar. All right, Henry Maar, I thank you so much for joining me on the program. I just want to say the name of your book before we even get started, because I think it'll link up well, and everyone will understand immediately why you and I should talk. The book is called Freeze. It's out right now from Cornell University Press. The book is called Freeze, the Grassroots Movement to Halt the Arms Race and End the Cold War. And for those that don't immediately recognize that word, freeze, Henry, your book is about the nuclear freeze movement. And I love it because it's a consideration like a lot of people we have on the show, a consideration of like what the legacy of the 60s and 70s is, and sort of weighing how much these movements actually matter or not. But thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, hey, thank you so much for having me on, and on such short notice too. Like I literally just connected maybe a week ago, so it's really great to have you on like that so quickly too. I really appreciate it.
I was, I get ideas for who to come on the show from a number of different sources, and one of them was for this one was an email listserv that I'm on. With Nelson Lichtenstein, who's a professor at UC Santa Barbara, who was on the show a couple years ago, and he sends out these notices about notable work and from UCSB historians. You got your PhD from Santa Barbara?
Yeah. My PhD was from UCSB in 2015, and Nelson Lichtenstein was my dissertation chair.
Nice. That makes sense, because he's sort of I think of him as someone who is talks about left politics a lot, right?
Yeah. So UCSB for me was one of these schools that was really up high on my list. And it was because of both Nelson Lichtenstein was there, who I considered to be kind of like, a left intellectual. But then they also kind of had this, Center for Cold War Studies with Salim Yaqub. And I was kind of, like when I was entering grad school, like 2008-ish, I had kind of a foot in both of these camps. I was interested in both kind of like, anti-war politics, and I was kind of interested in American foreign policy. This was kind of like in the immediate aftermath of the Iraq War. All that was still going on. So, the big intellectual discussions about, is the United States an empire? These were questions that were really interesting to me. And I think, I kind of entered, very, very wide open, thinking about, maybe I'll do something about the United States and Latin America, or maybe I'll do something. I was really interested in the Wobblies too. So, I think I remember talking to Nelson Lichtenstein about, maybe I'll write a dissertation about the Wobblies. And I think his kind of eyes rolled into the back of his head.
Why would his eyes roll back? Like it's an overdone topic, or it's something that he's really into?
I think that was his feeling was, like the Wobblies. How many times have we heard histories about the Wobblies?
What made you? I'm just curious. What made you bring this sort of interest in the left to UCSB?
Well, I mean, I think it kind of goes even further back. The Iraq War was certainly part of it. But I'd already kind of gotten infatuated with people like, Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, Michael Parenti, reading those works. Very eye-opening to me. Because, you go through high school education here. And, my high school education, I don't remember hearing a damn word about the United States involvement in Latin America. I didn't know a word about the CIA involvement in Guatemala or Iran, anything of that nature. No discussion about nuclear weapons. All that was kind of brand new to me and very exciting as an undergrad to learn about those sort of topics. And so I think that was kind of propelled me to hey, I want to go on and I want to study this stuff more in grad school.
Yeah, it's funny that it's very similar to me. I mean, we talk about Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn on the show a lot, and as these sort of godfathers for us. Yeah. In part because it is that sort of counter narrative to everything. It's not even a counter narrative, really. It's like a narrative, because you're right to say that what did I learn about U.S. relations with Latin America in high school? Not much. It was maybe stuff from the 19th century might have been mentioned, but nothing really.
Maybe the Spanish-American War, maybe, if I was lucky.
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of on
but
you to find that stuff.
Death squads in El Salvador.
That's right. Yeah, and it's I guess it's another part of what I wanted to talk with you about is sort of all of that history was going on when we were young. All of that. You would hear about El Salvador. I remember hearing about Nicaragua and hearing about drug wars and all these sorts of things that I had no idea because I was too young, and there certainly wasn't anyone on TV explaining it in any way that made sense.
Yeah. I mean, it was the same thing with me. I remember hearing about this sort of stuff. My memories of Ronald Reagan were basically my kindergarten class and looking up at the picture of Ronald Reagan on the wall, and that was basically my whole education of Reagan and as a child. And my parents were actually Republicans, so I can remember my earliest political memories. Okay, my parents are Republicans. I must be a Republican too. We're for George H.W. Bush. Dukakis can do caca. I remember my sister telling me that as a little kid. We like George H.W. Bush. So you just you go on as a child, or maybe even as a teenager. You just kind of go along with things if you're not really paying attention, if you're not reading, if you're not aware of the actual differences or the policies that are happening.
Yeah, no, that's very recognizable to me. I think I've told the story on this show of a neighbor that was big Republican that had we used to hang out at his house, and he had a dartboard with Saddam Hussein on it. and it was just sort of as a kid, I had no context to understand what we were doing other than the cool neighbor guy, says this is a bad dude. So this is a bad dude. And that's all I need to know.
And I think, talking about Saddam Hussein, I think that was one of the turning points for me. I remember at one point, hearing about Bill Clinton bombing Iraq. I was how did the Saddam Hussein guy get into power?
Right.
Well, it turns out the CIA had a helping hand in all of that.
Yeah, and it's something that is it's funny because as much of it as is part of my reading about all that stuff as I got older and as an undergrad and reading Chomsky and all that stuff, as much as it was part of part of understanding the world and geopolitics and things I never understood before. It was also kind of personal, like putting together a childhood that was like, wait a second, like I missed a lot of what was going on, especially like during the Reagan years. I think your book is in part a kind of reflection on how we come to terms with Reagan and how we come to terms with what all that means, because from a child's eyes, I mean, forget about it.
Yeah.
In terms of the nuclear freeze question, I guess we should start. I have so many questions about what it is. But like one of the big contexts of it that I thought was really compelling, that leaps out from your book, is this sort of idea in the wider culture that like Ronald Reagan ended the Cold War, and that Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev like found some sort of unique romantic friendship, and that story is like pretty well told, and I think it's kind of bizarre to me. I think your book answers a question for me, and I wonder what your response to this is. And the question for me has always been like, well, wait a second. To me, Ronald Reagan throughout his entire life was like one of the most virulent public anti-communists in American public life, right? And so it's weird that like the story ends with him like going and embracing the leader of the Soviet Union and them sort of ending the Cold War on a friendly note. But your story sort of fills it in a little bit for me, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, like the way that I was approaching this was to sort of think about. It was kind of like a Howard Zinn-like approach. Zinn was always, a big influence. I think I mentioned this here. You're not supposed to talk about Howard Zinn. Grad school, you're not supposed to read Howard Zinn. You're supposed to move on and read academic texts. Well, if you look at the academic literature on the end of the Cold War, we have maybe I don't want to get too deep into historiography, so I'll just kind of try to keep this simple. You have basically two approaches. You have the Reagan Victory School. Hurrah, hurrah. Ronald Reagan built up the nuclear weapons that were, that detente, and Jimmy Carter had subsequently underfunded. He built us up. He scared the Soviet Union. He put the nuclear weapons, the INF missiles, the Euro missiles, out into Germany. He forced the Soviet Union to the bargaining table. And therefore, the United States won the Cold War that way by forcing the Soviets to the bargaining table, by crippling their economy. Reagan wins the Cold War. That's the Reagan Victory School in a nutshell. Okay, so then you read real historians, actual historians of the Cold War, and what do they say about all of this? And it's a pretty universal. So maybe there's a little bit of differences here. You do have some who are kind of the opposite. Well, it's all about Mikhail Gorbachev, the cult of personality about Mikhail Gorbachev. And to some extent, there's a good deal to say about Mikhail Gorbachev bringing in kind of like a new presence to the Soviet Union, certainly being of a different generation than prior Soviet leaders. A lot of good things to say there about Gorbachev. But then you have the kind of like a more recent trend in the historiography where it's about bringing Reagan. Reagan is deflecting from the hawks, and Gorbachev is also kind of abandoning the hawks. And together they're meeting in the middle. And this is kind of how the Cold War is coming to an end. And I think there's some truth to that. I think there's some truth to Reagan kind of abandoning some of the more neocons in his administration, and I think there's some truth to Gorbachev also kind of getting away from some of the people, some of the generals, some of the more, I guess you could call them more right-wing generals in the Soviet Union, some of the more militant people in the Soviet Union. But regardless of which way we approach this, whether or not we think it's about Reagan or Gorbachev, we're kind of missing this piece. We're kind of missing like public opinion here. We're kind of missing domestic politics. We're kind of ignoring this entire anti-nuclear movement. We're dismissing it. And I think part of the reason that story gets dismissed is because Reagan wins re-election in 1984. And, whoever hears about the nuclear freeze movement after that, it's just sort of deemed a failure. And even some of the freeze activists kind of thought of themselves as being a failure. Nobody ever really talks about the nuclear freeze movement as having any kind of impact on Reagan. It's now the literature on Reagan is now turned to like things like Reagan is on his quest to abolish nuclear weapons. Reagan is fighting a secret war against nuclear weapons. It's almost like you have this kind of new version of Reagan. You can think of it as sort of like Reagan Victory School light, diet Reagan Victory School,
right? Yeah,
sugar-free Reagan Victory School. All the taste of Reagan Victory School, but no calories.
So what happened in the American population around nuclear war in the early 80s? Because I mean, we know the big context is there's sort of like the end of détente, and there's sort of like this increased tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, and there's a lot of different sort of explanations for that. But one of them is something that you and I probably both remember, which is that the threat of nuclear war was somehow around us in the culture, on the news, etc. It's certainly something that I thought about at a very, very young age. And from my perspective, I mean, I remember being terrified about it. And it seems like what your book is locating is sort of that being a pretty widespread feeling.
Yeah, that fear of nuclear war. It sort of permeates the culture of the 1980s. And as I kind of show in this book, so I go back and I kind of retell the story of like, how does that come to permeate the culture? Because it's not really like, if you go back to the 1970s, you look at sort of what happened to the American peace movement following Vietnam. And some of that energy is going into nuclear weapons, but not all of it. So, I mean, like you look at like a Tom Hayden figure, SDS. SDS is kind of, imploded. Tom Hayden is off doing, domestic politics, running for Senate, things of that nature. Abby Hoffman's gone underground. Some of these left magazines are kind of folding in. The peace energy is really kind of dispersed, and they're trying to figure out where exactly are we going. And there are some activists. This is a small group. They're saying, well, hey, we need a new thing. We need to kind of stop the next Vietnam War before it starts. And so we need things like peace conversion of the economy. We need to stop production of nuclear weapons like the B-1 bomber. We need to stop the arms race, and instead of supporting militarism in this country, military Keynesianism, we need to stop funding that and start funding human needs. And so you have that developing alongside in the 1970s, like a new emerging environmental movement. So we see a lot of anti-nuclear power stuff happening in the 1970s. And these two movements are kind of running parallel. Mm-hmm. There's a little bit of overlap between them, but there's also a lot of tension. Some of the people in the anti-nuclear power movement think that if you start focusing on nuclear weapons, you're just going to distract from the real issue here of nuclear power. Mm. But what's really going to change from, say, like the 1970s, mid 70s into like the later 70s, early 80s is really the Cold War and kind of the end of détente. So, again, just kind of summarize some things quickly. The Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan in 79 really is kind of the kicker to what some people call the Second Cold War. Mm-hmm. So then Reagan comes into office, right? And Reagan is campaigning on things. Détente is just a one-way street. Arms control, useless. We need to re-up our military to fight the Soviet Union. And Reagan enters office, and he's giving us all kinds of speeches denouncing the Soviet Union. They're the evil empire. We got to leave them in the ash heap of history. He says at his very first press conference, the Soviet Union reserves unto themselves the right to lie, to cheat. Not very friendly diplomatic language. But then on top of all that, it kind of gets worse. It's
kind of amazing too, after after Vietnam being such a massive, public tragedy, crime that totally twisted American politics and society for more than a decade, for Ronald Reagan to then relight the fire of anti-communism in that way, and the Cold War specifically.
Yeah, I mean, so he's entering this. Is this all like, we're within a decade of the end of the Vietnam, not even a decade after, the last troops have left Vietnam, where Reagan's already out on the campaign trail and trying to, in another sense, he's trying to rewrite that narrative about the Vietnam War.
Totally.
Trying to make it about, this was a tragedy. And there's even, the neocons too. We're trying to rewrite the narrative that we should have stayed and fought. That was our problem. We lost the war at home. We didn't lose it, over there in the jungles of Vietnam. It was lost at the home front. Mm-hmm.
And communism is still the major evil in the world. Yeah.
And so, of course, getting back to Reagan and how does this whole anti-nuclear stuff start? How does that all start to kind of permeate in the culture? I argue in the book, and I kind of walk people through some of this. Some of the stuff we were talking about, the harsh rhetoric that Reagan has. Well, then there's also this kind of talk. There's this loose talk about maybe we can fight and maybe we can win and survive nuclear war. And of course, this is his Secretary of State, Al Haig, is giving his testimony when they're at his nomination hearing, and he says something to the likes of, well, maybe we can fire a warning shot over Europe. at head of arms control disarmament agency, the agency that's supposed to oversee our commitment to the nuclear proliferation treaty, oversee that we are disarming, that we're working towards a goal of nuclear zero. Head of that, he puts Eugene Rostow in charge. Eugene Rostow had never seen an arms control treaty he liked. Right. Rostow states at his testimony, he says something like, nuclear war is survivable. Look at Japan; it flourished right after World War II. There's nothing, 10 million people die. That's not the whole population. So there's just really like a loose talk among people in the administration. And then you get to probably the most infamous, which was T.K. Jones, who has this very, fancy title. He's, part of the whole arms control administration, part of the administration, works on arms control, big, long title. He tells Robert Scheer of the LA Times, Robert Scheer's interviewing him, and he says something to him along the lines of, of course, nuclear war is survivable. All we have to do is, start digging up some dirt, build up some shelters. You throw a few feet of dirt on top of the shelters, and it's the dirt that does it. Becomes Scheer's book with enough shovels.
I mean, it's like literally fucking Dr. Strangelove, right? I mean,
literally.
The people the people that are in Reagan's administration sound like the like satirical psychos of a movie from 1964. It's kind of insane, and I think, obviously we were too young to get it, but people who lived through the 60s must have been tearing their hair out over this, and it seems like some of them were the ones that are the ones that are getting involved in organizing Freeze, right? And getting out. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what that concept is, like what the Freeze means?
I'm happy to go back and flesh that out a little bit. Yeah, so again, we're talking about this kind of two waves of the anti-nuclear movement. You have your nuclear power, your anti-nukes, or anti-nuclear weapon people. And then towards the late 70s, you have a peace movement that's also very divided about what direction should we take. And there's a lot of calls for we should be unilaterally disarming ourselves. It's better. We're better off if the Soviets, even if the Soviets invade. There's literally a comment in one of the literature, one of the zines of the period. We're literally better off if the Soviets invade us and conquer us than we are if there's a nuclear war. So there's talk about we should have unilateral disarmament.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of discussion about what direction should this movement go. And it's still a very small movement in the late 70s. You have a woman named Randy Forsberg who comes into this picture. And Randy calls herself a different kind of arms control advocate. She's not somebody who had this deep background in the Vietnam War. She attended a few Vietnam anti-war rallies, but she wasn't part of the Chicago 8 or something of that nature. Mm-hmm. She wasn't a yippie or anything of that nature.
Is she a little bit younger than the rest of that generation, Forsberg?
I want to say she's probably a little younger, but she was probably in her 20s during that stuff. Kind of early adulthood when all that was going on. Mm-hmm. She ends up moving to Sweden, and in Sweden you have all these kind of refugees coming over from America. And so this kind of creates in Sweden, you can't get away from the war in Vietnam. So this kind of, starts kind of how to put this, she's thinking, this is kind of taking place inside of her mind as she's kind of working at a job with the Stockholm Institute of Peace. Then from there, she's learning all about how much money these countries are spending on nuclear weapons. And so long story short, she ends up going to this group, the Mobilization for Society, sometimes called the MOB. Mm-hmm. And she gives a speech at this conference, a very short 10-minute speech at their conference in December of 1979. And she proposes to them, instead of you guys all talking about maybe unilateral disarmament, why don't we have a bilateral freeze? Why don't we both ask the Soviet Union and the United States to simultaneously freeze or halt the building of nuclear weapons, the testing of nuclear weapons, and the deployment of nuclear weapons. Because remember, this is the time when we're talking about, they haven't yet deployed those Euro missiles, but the late 70s, they're talking about putting these missiles into Germany and into Italy. And so that's kind of the context in which all that's coming out of.
Okay.
And so this idea is it's permeating in society in the early 1980s. You had different people who were picking up on this, even if they weren't actually in that meeting. So out in Massachusetts in 1980, during the 1980 election, there's this question that gets put on the ballot, and it's being organized by people like Daniel Ellsberg and Randy Keeler, who's another anti-war activist, somebody who actually had a much more deeper background in Vietnam anti-war activism. And they're putting on the ballot, a bilateral freeze as well, asking the United States and the Soviet Union to both mutually freeze the production, the testing, the deployment of all nuclear weapons. And that actually passes in the same districts that Ronald Reagan is getting elected president.
That's amazing to me, and I'm interested in sort of exactly how that happens, because when I was a teenager, or maybe in my early 20s, I went to Washington D.C. and I saw a woman who's pretty famous. Like I think she's not around anymore, but she was
Connie?
outside the White House in a tent. And I was really struck by her and really like touched by it. And I was always sort of like, felt like a sort of connection to the anti-nuclear movement one way or the other. But I always considered it sort of a fringe thing, something that was like off to the side. But what you're saying is that like at a certain point, there are like senators Kennedy, etc., are putting forth propositions in Congress that are almost exactly what the nuclear movement is proposing, and that to me is interesting, like how that happens.
Yeah,
because it's not a fringe movement for a moment.
Yeah, so I mean, this thing it's picking up. It picks up like a wildfire almost. It starts in the grassroots and it starts quickly spreading. Like I was saying, it started in Massachusetts with the ballot referendum. Shortly thereafter, you start seeing city after city passing, across the Northeast, at least initially, passing these different city resolutions saying, hey, we support a bilateral freeze on the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so eventually somebody picks up on this. Somebody from Edward Markey's office picks up on this, and they go to Ed Markey, who's already like an opponent of the nuclear weapons, but he was also really a stronger opponent of nuclear power during the late 70s. But they go to Ed Markey and they say, this thing's a wild horse. This thing is ready to take off. You can be on the front edge of this movement. We should get behind this. And so this is how kind of like the ball gets starting to roll in the Congress. And eventually, Markey is trying to introduce legislation. He's trying to make sure that it's bipartisan too. He doesn't want it to appear that this is just a Democratic thing. He wants to make sure that you also bring in some Republicans too. So he gets his colleague Silvio Conti, who's also of Massachusetts, to co-sponsor the legislation. Conti being a Republican, and eventually this is going to go over to the Senate too. And so that's when you get Ted Kennedy is getting on board this thing. Mark Hatfield, who has, a World War II veteran out of Oregon, Republican Oregon, different kind of Republican, gets on board with this too and helps co-sponsor that legislation. And there's this really fascinating scene when Ted Kennedy goes to introduce this legislation. I looked all over for a photo of this. I couldn't find it. There's got to be a photo of this somewhere. But Ted Kennedy calls this press conference to introduce his legislation with Hatfield. And he's just kind of surrounded by like all these famous people. You've got like Carl Sagan there. You've got like a Catholic bishop behind him. You've got kind of all elements of people who are going to compose the freeze movement are kind of like standing right beside him. I looked all over for this photo, checking Getty, checking everywhere.
It's got to be somewhere.
It's got to be somewhere.
Yeah.
I envisioned this scene of Carl Sagan standing next to him.
Right. Because it's like Carl Sagan representing secular science, but also like these Catholic bishops, and I think that part of it is important too. Is that there's this sort of like religious element. Is it all around? Like is it in other words is there sort of like a morality to this movement? Is it sort of like about avoiding apocalypse, saving our children from nuclear war? Is that what the tone of it is?
I think that's part of the tone is trying to save ourselves from ourselves, basically.
Right.
I mean, it starts with, again, like we were talking about, it starts back in the 70s, at least the late 70s, early 80s, when the movement is starting. It's about, stopping nuclear weapons, defunding the arms race and funding human needs. You see this on like the banners. If you look at the banners of the New York City March in 1982, the 1 million person march that's featured on the cover of the book, some of those banners are saying things like, defund the arms race, fund human needs. And that's a callback to like mobilization for society. And so that's part of it. There's a lot of morality involved in all this. And the Catholic bishops are a really important part of all this when they get a hold of this. The Catholic bishops are interesting because you have to go back and you have to kind of put them in the context of Vatican II. A lot of these bishops are coming out of Vatican II. And there's a kind of more how to put this. There was this kind of issue that maybe they had dropped the ball on Vietnam, that they had spoken out about Vietnam, but they did so well after the war had become unpopular in America. And so for some of these bishops, there was this feeling like, we need to get out in front of this. We need to stop, the next war before it happens. Sort of like some of these activists were saying, we need to stop the next Vietnam War from happening.
Right.
I think you still had that kind of going on with the Catholic bishops, particularly again coming out of Vatican II. So it starts with Joseph Cardinal Bernardin in Chicago. He starts drafting a pastoral letter. He gets a committee of some of these other bishops together, and they start drafting a pastoral letter that's very critical of the arms race. And they're trying to stay away. It's really interesting because I actually got into the actual meeting minutes of the bishops. I got access to those from the Chicago Archdiocese. They gave me permission to go look through his papers, which was really cool. So I looked through his papers, and if you read these debates that's going on, they're very much worried about being seen as political. They want to be seen as apolitical in all this. They want to be seen as just being like a voice of morality on all this. But of course, you can't avoid being political. This is becoming a political issue. The Reagan administration is absolutely opposed to a nuclear freeze. And that's
what I was going to ask, is what's the other part of this? Because it seems like, I don't know. When you think about something like the military-industrial complex, I think of it as all the way from, this was in part why the New Left existed in the first place, was sort of pushing back against the power and the disproportionate place that the military has in our culture and in our government especially. And it seems immovable. It seems like a lot of people, I think, see it as totally immovable. But it seems like your story is partly an example of it moving in some way, because Reagan is going to initially, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the initial right reaction is to try to red bait these people and say these are just all a bunch of commies. Yeah. But that's not going to necessarily work. Yeah. So that's part of the story too. So the initial decision is, okay, well, let's get out in front of this movement. Let's try to dismiss it. Let's red bait it. So Reagan goes on TV and he says, those anti-nuclear protesters, they're part of this thing called the World Peace Council, Soviet Union, communism, basically trying to link this movement to the Soviet Union. Randy Forsberg, who I said before, the person who came up with this whole concept of nuclear freeze, is being tailed by the FBI. The FBI is looking into her background. They're trying to find, are there connections between her and some of the communists in the movement? What are her connections to the World Peace Council? There's an entire FBI investigation into the nuclear freeze movement to try to find communist ties. Now, I FOIA'd the FBI to try to get their report on the nuclear freeze movement. The FBI tells me they had no records of it. So amazing. Yeah. Even though I sent them the copy of the New York Times where they talk about the FBI conclusion of the report. Of course, the FBI found no ties of the freeze movement to the Soviet Union. But naturally, the FBI has no records of this. They did give me Randy Forsberg's FBI file, though. That's how I know that they were kind of trailing her and kind of tracking her, trying to find out who she knew and if she was having any meetings with some of the members of the Soviet Union or what have you. Some of the members of the World Peace Council. It's kind of incredible. They're some of those FBI files, I think, are better historical sources than any other source in terms of just the details of people's lives. I mean, the historian or a writer, Mary Hershberger, wrote a book called Jane Fonda's War, about Jane Fonda, entirely from FBI records, because they followed every move of Jane Fonda throughout that era. Doesn't surprise me that Forsberg would be followed as well. Yeah, remember they were also deeply interested in the movies in the early years of the Cold War. That's right. What about the religious element of this? Because you talk about, the Catholic bishops are one thing, but when I think about the 80s and when I think about Reagan, I have in my head almost the Righteous Gemstones, evangelical movement being very powerful, and Falwell and all that. How are they reacting to this? Yeah. And so it's fascinating. So it's not just about the Catholic bishops. They're important. And as I make the argument in the book, I think they're kind of the way in which the Reagan administration has to back off from
trying to red bait the movement. Not only does it not work, but now you've got Catholic bishops who are involved, and Catholic bishops represent Catholic voters who are incredibly important to the Reagan administration. Now, in terms of the evangelicals, this is also, at one point I was trying to decide if I was going to do an entire chapter on evangelicals, or if how would I fold them into the mix here. And I think originally I had them as just part of the chapter on the bishops, but I decided I'd kind of put them in a different chapter. The evangelicals are interesting because you've got this kind of split going on in the evangelicals about this community. So on the one hand, you've got Jerry Falwell out there calling these people freeze Nukes. And he's dismissing the whole, he's dismissing him again, trying to explain that this is the tune that the Soviet Union wants you to believe. This is coming, the Reagan administration is basically, after that, the Catholic bishops get involved. They're allowing, they're not speaking openly against the movement and the bishops. They're taking a very different tone. They're taking a very much more respectful tone. And you see this in the internal documents too. They're talking about how we can't be seen as fighting men of the cloth. So they leave that to their allies in the press. They leave that to a Pat Buchanan to write an article against the bishops or against the nuclear freeze movement. They leave that to other bishops who are more friendly to the administration to kind of take cracks at the Catholic bishops and the nuclear freeze movement. The Reagan administration tries to be very respectful. But talking about administration allies, you have Jerry Falwell, as I was saying, takes out a whole page ad. And I believe this was in, I want to say, the Wall Street Journal, an entire page ad, basically denouncing the nuclear freeze movement and asking you at the very bottom, there's this little thing that you clip off and you can send a donation to Falwell.
Always. Yeah.
And evangelicals are, if you look at the opinion polls, evangelicals are very much in support of the nuclear freeze movement. And this is kind of what drives Reagan. We think of the evil empire speech that Reagan gives. We usually don't put that into the context in which it's given. Reagan is giving this speech to the Conference of Evangelicals. And he's doing so because he wants to try to persuade evangelicals from adopting a nuclear freeze resolution, just like the Catholic bishops are doing. So if you look at that context of that evil empire speech, the lines before it are all about the nuclear freeze movement. So that evil empire speech that we remember for the rhetoric for that line, evil empire, is actually trying to persuade evangelicals not to adopt a nuclear freeze, just like the Catholic bishops.
That's incredible. I mean, to me, that makes it sound like Reagan is on the defensive here, and that he's sort of like realizing that he's lost portions of a coalition, I guess, if that makes sense. Like that's what matters. It's not just some fringe hippies outside in a tent. These are actually touching groups of people that I need on my side.
Yeah, exactly. And they're very much on the defensive about this. And you see this in the internal documents too. There's one document, I'm forgetting who wrote the document off the top of my head. It was somebody who was higher up. I have this it's in the book, and I'm working on an op-ed right now for the Washington Post.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll share that.
This will be in it too. I'm forgetting who gave this quote, but he says something the likes of, the freeze movement has our attention, and we should keep this secret. We should not let them know that they have our attention.
Yeah. That you know what? That sounds so Nixonian because I mean, Nixon was in public, he was anti-war movement. What are you talking about? I don't even know what that is. And then in private, it's all they fucking talked about was what are they going to do about these people?
This is for Nick. I mean, going to Nixon, you listen to those tapes, and it's all about detente is all about the anti-war movement. How
Johnson too.
The anti-war movement. Yeah.
And so to me, the people that are oh, these movements don't matter, popular movements don't matter, they don't have any impact. I'm I don't know. I mean, you listen to these tapes, these presidents are scared shitless about the power of these movements.
Yeah, I mean, you put 1 million people into the streets of New York City, you're going to get some fucking attention.
Right. Yeah.
We've had some social movements do that. The Me Too movement got a lot of people into the streets. Across different cities. Black Lives Matter, and I'm sure if 20 years, if we can get inside the Donald Trump administration or even the Biden administration, there's got to be some discussions about these movements that were happening.
Oh, well, I mean, just think about the George Floyd protests and Trump coming outside and holding up the Bible. I thought that was almost actually a weak moment from him. I was he's he really feels like he needs to do something to control the narrative here. That's sort of he's losing control of.
And I think that's what goes back to the Reagan administration. They were very much worried about losing this narrative. Because you go back to 1982, June of 82, you've had that million-person march in the streets of New York City. You go to November of 1982, the second draft of the Catholic bishop's pastoral letter gets leaked. And again, as I was saying, very critical. The second draft is even more critical of the Reagan administration in the arms race, and it's even more supportive of the nuclear freeze movement. You've got in Congress, you've got the legislation going on. You've got this battle for the legislation for a nuclear freeze movement going on in the House of Representatives. Now that vote loses, but it's a very tense vote. It's a very tense moment, and it goes back and forth, and they lose by like maybe 2 votes. So the 1982 midterm elections are coming up. Well, Reagan's going to lose, as most presidents tend to do. They tend to lose the midterm elections. We see a much stronger Democratic Congress coming in, so there's a lot of hope that, okay, we can revisit this legislation in 1983 and we'll pass it then. But on top of that, you have all these various state resolutions going on. So you have, I want to say, 10 different state resolutions adopting a nuclear freeze. 9 of the 10 state resolutions on the ballot, these ballot resolutions. And of the 10, 9 of them pass. Wow. At the same time, as this is going on, internally, the Reagan administration is trying to push back on all these. They have a vast campaign going on, vast public relations campaign. They're hitting the airwaves. They're hitting the streets. They're trying to push back on all this. They're trying to get their reliable allies out there in the press and on this radio to kind of push back against. They have talking points written up. They're trying to push back against the nuclear freeze. They're trying to say, hey, if you adopt a nuclear freeze, you're going to put us in a position of weakness towards the Soviet Union. And of course, you don't want the United States to be behind the Soviet Union in an arms race, do you? I mean, this kind of gets to like what they in some of the public opinion polls. If you look at some of the polls, sometimes you'll hear, the nuclear freeze movement was a mile wide, but only an inch deep. Because if you look at, like, say, a public opinion poll, do you support a nuclear weapons freeze? Majority will say yes. And so, after the day after, it was something like 88% of the population said, yes, I support a nuclear weapons freeze. So, bipartisan across the board support for a nuclear freeze. But then you start to see these kind of leading questions that are being asked. Would you still support a nuclear freeze if you knew that it would put the United States in a position of inferiority towards the Soviet Union?
Right. Would you still support? Would you still support it if the Soviet Union was going to enslave your children as part of the deal?
Yeah.
That sort of stuff.
God, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Leading questions.
The movie the day after. When was that? Was that in 83?
Yeah, so that comes in November of 83. You're in 1983. You're in a very tense, the fall of 1983. It's very incredibly tense moments there with the shooting down of the Korean airliner. You've got Able Archer going on, the war games exercise that nearly leads to nuclear war because the Soviets have concerns that they're seeing these signals going back and forth between the United States and Great Britain. Well, the United States had just recently invaded Grenada, a commonwealth of Britain. So there's a lot of back and forth there. The British weren't too happy about that. There's a lot of back and forth. The Soviets didn't quite understand that aspect. But you have a very tense situation developing. The Euro missiles I was talking about before are on the verge of being deployed to Western Germany, and the danger there is that if you put these, if you don't know much about nuclear weapons, if you think about it this way, what's the difference between, say, like an ICBM and one of these INF missiles? Well, an ICBM takes, say, like 30 minutes or so to be detected, or for 30 minutes from, say, launch to target. An INF missile would take, say, 4 to 5 minutes, maybe. So you don't have this window where you can figure out, is this a real launch, or is this just a malfunctioning computer chip? Is this just did somebody just leave the test tape in the inside, and that's why we're thinking that there's an incoming attack? Right.
I remember this as part of the terror, and honestly, if I'm honest, it's still part of the terror. Is the idea that there are only single actors and technology together could create situations that might be misunderstood. Like, in other words, we could blow ourselves up on accident.
And I think that's that's really what it comes down to. Would there ever really be a shooting war between the United States and the Soviet Union? Possibly, but most likely the real danger with nuclear weapons is about the accidental nuclear launch.
Right.
And again, this is the stuff that nuke mares are made of.
Yeah, totally.
I remember in grad school, when I first started reading about some of this stuff, I made the mistake of reading this stuff late at night, on the bed before I go to bed, and, had some pretty bad dreams that night.
Oh, yeah. No, but I mean,
there's lots of stuff. I mentioned, a training exercise tape, a malfunctioning computer chip, birds on a flock of birds on the radar screen creating an echo. And these are all real things that happened.
Yeah.
These are all things that could have potentially started a nuclear war by accident.
Part of the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a lot of fake shit happening on the radar, people projecting ideas onto what was happening. It was a human error combined with technological error, combined with the insane sort of context of the Cold War amping up tensions. And it seems like, you're talking about fall 1983, this movie The Day After, which is a TV movie, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so the day after, it's premiering on ABC television in the fall of 1983, right as all this stuff is happening. Right after the Cal shoot down in September, the American public doesn't know about the Able Archer incident that's happening at the very same exact moment. They don't know about Stanislav Petrov in the Soviet Union stopping a potential nuclear war, accidental nuclear war there. So there's a lot of stuff the public doesn't know about, but they do know about this movie that's happening because you put this in the context of 1983. There's not a whole lot on TV. You don't have Netflix. You don't have Amazon Prime. There's no Twitter to just kind of doom scroll through. So there's a limited.
The good old days.
There's the Sunday night movie that everybody gathers around with the family to go see. And ABC is putting on this nuclear film called The Day After. And it's a very controversial film, controversial even before it starts. The Reagan administration is pushing back on this film. Reagan has already seen it privately. And we see this a lot. If you look at the literature, it's interesting on this. A lot of people like to emphasize that, Reagan watched this privately and he was very concerned. And yeah, he was. Reagan always... You had to show things to Reagan. You couldn't put a briefing pile in front of Reagan and expect him to read that and get it. But if you showed him a movie, he might get the message a little bit clearer. And so Reagan watches this film, in October, just before it actually premieres to the whole public. And he writes in his diary about how moving it is to him. Well, come November, when it's airing on ABC, he writes again in his diary, calling it anti-nuke propaganda. We got to do whatever we can to stop this. So the Reagan administration has, all kinds of talking points available to try to dismiss The Day After. They've got a whole hotline set up so that people can call and, talk about their fears and be talked down.
Wow.
Yeah. And of course, this movie, as I was saying, you don't have a whole lot of entertainment options in 1983. So you gather around and you watch The Day After, the ABC Sunday night movie that everybody's talking about. And it's going on throughout the papers. You see candlelight visuals are being held across the country. There are senators, like a senator from California, Alan Cranston, Democrat. He's running for president in 1984. Wants to win the Democratic nomination. He's going to hold a whole viewing party for this thing. And of course, you can go to this viewing party and you can donate to the Cranston for President campaign. So this is really, again, it's one of these moments where the entire country is kind of watching this film together. A lot of same things like we're seeing with Don't Look Up right now, where a lot of people are sitting around talking about this film. People were doing that in 1983 with The Day After. And what makes The Day After, if we watch it today, the graphics and all that, they look a little bit hokey. Because it's 1983. It's a made-for-television movie. It doesn't have the budget of, say, Don't Look Up.
Right.
But
or even E.T. or something. From that era. Right.
Yeah. It's a made-for-TV movie, so it doesn't have the star power. It has some stars, like Steve Guttenberg from Police Academy.
Oh, geez. I didn't realize Guttenberg was in this one.
Yeah.
He makes odd appearances throughout the 80s. I'll be watching old 80s, and there's Steve Guttenberg. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think he's actually one of the stars of this movie too.
What is the movie about? Is it literally about an accidental nuclear attack or a shooting war?
It's a shooting war.
Wow.
it's in part about the shooting war, but it's really about like the aftermath of the shooting war. So like we get into this, and it kind of brings us this tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, and of course at some point we decide that we are going to turn the keys and we're going to launch the nuclear war against the Soviet Union, because they've I haven't watched the film in a while, but I believe they had in the film script they had either invaded Western Germany, or they had invaded Poland. But of course the Soviets invaded someplace, and we don't know who fired the first shot, but either the Soviets fired their missiles or the United States fired their missiles. There's a nuclear war happening. Now, I want to say it was Lawrence, Kansas gets wiped out or something like this. And we're showing like the aftermath of like what the nuclear war actually looks like, how these hospitals are being overrun.
Oh God. Wow.
Yeah. Sounds familiar.
Yeah. So they're doing, so it's a lot of like, sort of like the violence of nuclear
trying
war.
to portray like, what exactly would a nuclear war look like? Because here we've had in the past year or two, people from, as I was saying earlier, people from the administration talking loosely about fighting and winning nuclear war, survivable nuclear war, building shelters, throwing dirt on top of them, firing warning shots over Europe. Very loose, very casual talk about nuclear war. Well, here's a film that's trying to show you what exactly nuclear war would look like.
Yeah, it seems like, and it's something that comes out in your book that struck me, is this idea that the American public is sort of coming to terms with this idea of nuclear war as an apocalyptic event or like an extinction level event rather than something that's survivable. At the same time, leaders are saying like, no, it's survivable, which seems insane, a conversation to be having in the 80s after, I don't know, like there's this movie Atomic Cafe, which seems like it's part of this movement, right? Like in some ways, it came out in the early 80s, right?
It's in the context of all this too that's coming out.
Yeah, I mean, I've used clips from that. If you're a U.S. history teacher doing the 20th century, Atomic Cafe is like one of the best, like collection of primary sources. But one of the things that's in that movie is there's a Columbia University professor who's interviewed in the 1950s or 60s, and he's saying that bomb shelters don't work. And that, in fact, the people that were in bomb shelter type stuff in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki were actually incinerated. And it's just like, it's impossible to think of surviving a nuclear war, and we shouldn't be thinking about along those terms at all. So that's why I'm saying it's like kind of incredible that like they bring this back in the 80s and are still trying to sell this idea of a survivable nuclear war to a public that doesn't seem like it's buying it.
Yeah, I think that's part of like what's fueling the nuclear freeze movement, is just like you didn't have to be a committed nuclear freeze activist. Maybe you didn't know like everybody involved in the movement. Maybe you weren't, giving money to the movement, but you identified as somebody who was opposed to nuclear war, that you understood what this campaign was asking for. And I think like you see this like throughout the culture too, that it's not just about like, say, like if you look at the popular culture, not just the day after, you see this kind of lots of anti-nuke stuff happening throughout the culture. It's really kind of reaching even the apolitical. Even if you weren't attending mass and listening to Catholic bishops or listening to evangelicals about the nuclear arms race, even if you weren't paying attention to the Congress, you couldn't escape the fact that there was, a potential nuclear war could happen between the United States and the Soviet Union. Whether you're listening to, say, like, the Dead Kennedys who are performing at like the Rock Against Reagan concerts, or you're listening to like more underground bands like Scream, Came Without a Warning, which Dave Grohl's former band from DC. Or not just the underground metal or the underground punk scene, but the mainstream music. You could be listening to Prince, and you could learn about the dangers of nuclear war. 1999, a song about like dancing the night away and partying in the midst of an apocalypse. And you had other like songs, one-hit wonders. Fishbone. If you thought about like Fishbone, Party at Ground Zero.
I remember Fishbone.
Fishbone. They're partying as the nuclear war is going on. If you watch the video, there's even this kind of like Dr. Strangelove moment where they bring out the guy in the wheelchair, and then there's this big, nuclear explosion behind him.
Yeah, it was everywhere. It really was.
Yeah. It's everywhere. That's kind of my point in this book, is that it's reaching everywhere, and so it's putting pressure on the administration that they have to do something. They can't just red bait the nuclear freeze movement. They can't just dismiss it. They can't dismiss all this, pressure to do something about the arms race. Even after they deployed these nuclear weapons, we see in 1984, the conversation really starts to shift among the Reaganites. And you have arguments out there that it's about the Able Archer thing, and it's about Reagan's own anti-nuclear beliefs. And what I'm trying to argue in this book is that Reagan maybe Reagan did harbor these views internally about hating nuclear weapons. Maybe he did kind of have these internal disagreements inside of himself about both wanting to build nuclear weapons and both hating them internally. But what we see happening by 1984 is just so much pressure on the Reagan administration to kind of reverse the arms race. And of course, you have an election coming up. And so like his advisors are even telling him, we've got to do something about this, the nuclear arms race. This is the issue of 1984. The economy has already recovered by 1984. So that's not the issue. The issue is sagging poll numbers about arms control. People worried about a nuclear war. And you see this in the polling. They're worried about, hey, let's look at the Catholic vote. And Catholics still favor a nuclear freeze movement. So Reagan is going to Catholic audiences and on the campaign stump. If you listen to some of his speeches, he never mentions nuclear freeze to them. He'll hit on everything from abortion, prayer in school, all the hot topics that affect them, but kind of leaves off the table nuclear war. But we also see kind of like a real shift in his dialogue too. There's no longer any kind of leaking coming on from the administration about survivable nuclear war, except in August of 84. Reagan, you might be familiar with this, on the hot mic.
Yes, of course.
Reagan's making this so-called joke. We begin bombing the Soviet Union in 5 minutes. And of course, this gets like massive airplay. And of course, it's funny because the Democrats really don't kind of bash him on this. There's some kind of scolding on this, but they don't really make it a big key issue. And partly with the Democrats too. Like I'm very critical of the Democrats in this book. If you look at 1984, all the Democrats were basically anybody who was running for president in 1984 on the Democratic Party was looking at the nuclear freeze movement and trying to get their support. And so we'll see, they all have kind of different stances on like what they'll support and what they are kind of, not really getting behind. So for instance, like Alan Cranston, again, Senator of California, very much like very much somebody who is in favor of a nuclear freeze. He's an ally of the campaign, and yet he doesn't want to put any restrictions on building the B-1 bomber because that's being built in California, and that's jobs for him, and that's the union behind him, that's campaign donations.
That's exactly what I was talking about with that sort of idea of the immovable military-industrial complex.
Military-industrial complex, military Keynesianism. You call it what you want. Empire, militarism. You have lots of ways to describe this.
Right. And it seems like there's a lot of posturing, right? There's a lot of like moving around here. I think part of what's fascinating about your book is this idea. You're writing about the power of political culture in some way, and like the kind of like the. I mean, it's a word that's used a lot, like, and it's a word that you're probably not even allowed to use as a historian. It's another one of those Howard Zinn things, but like you're talking about the zeitgeist in some way. You know what I mean? You're talking about this this feeling, and you can kind of reduce it to the movie. I don't think the movie is that The Day After is really that much of it, but it seems like the movie kind of reflects and communicates at the same time how widespread this fear is and this feeling is, and the freeze movement is. I guess you would agree is that the freeze movement is sort of like concentrating that power in some way and like sort of shaping it into an actual political threat, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think largely what it's doing is I think the culture that we're seeing around like anti-nukes is really like a byproduct of the nuclear freeze movement.
Right.
I don't think you would have had all this anti-nuke talk if it wasn't for like this large movement. Bringing 1 million people into the streets, putting pressure on the Congress.
It's funny
getting the Catholic bishops involved, bringing evangelicals in. I mean, it's ubiquitous in the culture of the 1980s.
So how does this story end, and how optimistic should we be about it? Because in a lot of ways, it kind of, I feel like your story is around 1984 and this election, and ultimately Reagan and Gorbachev, entering into what becomes the end of the Cold War. seems like it's like the next part of this story, and it feels like to me freeze is an integral part of understanding how all this happened, and yet your book is brand new. Your book is like, say, hold on, we haven't really considered how important this is.
There's a lot of things. We have a lot that's been written about the Cold War. We had some really great scholars out there on the Cold War, people who I'm indebted to, like a Walter Lefebvre figure, who I never got to meet Walter, but been a big impact on me, very influential on my thoughts on the Cold War. But getting back to the book, 1984, how does all this kind of end? Well, the good news is that we didn't have a nuclear war. Maybe the bad news was that Reagan won re-election.
Right.
But I get into this in the book. Okay, so the freeze movement, this is why I think a lot of people look at the freeze movement and say, well, oh yeah, it was an absolute failure. 1984, Reagan swamps Walter Mondale to the point, maybe this is like a Jeopardy question. In 1984, Ronald Reagan ran against this.
Yeah, who? Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Who did he run against? Yeah.
John Kerry's eventual fate.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got Mondale, who runs this very miserable campaign. And both Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro, his vice president, were in favor of a nuclear freeze, but they have this kind of like lukewarm approach to it all. And Mondale even makes they get into this debate. Mondale is kind of like, so you have two debates between Mondale and Reagan. And the first debate, Ronald Reagan looks really old. He looks very tired. He's kind of has a bad performance. And so there's all this talk like, okay, maybe Reagan's too old. And if Mondale goes into this next debate, maybe he can kind of change the picture. Maybe he can kind of really pull himself within striking distance of Reagan. And he goes into this next debate, and like Reagan really kind of looks like himself, the avuncular, kind of jovial figure of Reagan, kind of putting on that performance. And Mondale says something to him along the lines when he's asked about, the Strategic Defense Initiative, what we call Star Wars, missile defense. They ask him about, would you pursue Star Wars? And Mondale's like, well, yeah, of course I would pursue Star Wars too. But, unlike Reagan, I'm willing to share this with the Soviet Union. And that's his real key distinction there on SDI. He's willing to share the technology, the technology that doesn't exist,
right?
Technology that really came between us and maybe the eventual abolition of nuclear weapons between Reagan and Gorbachev. So Freeze loses the election in 1984 to Reagan. They don't get their nuclear freeze, and there's a lot of kind of like hand wringing in the movement about like what are the next steps to go to. And there've been, you've already had these kind of tensions that were building in the movement. There was, if you go back to the call to halt the arms race, as I talked about at the beginning of our chat, it was bilateral, right? They wanted to make sure that they weren't going to be called unilateral disarmers. They wanted to have this kind of moderate proposal. That's what it is. It's kind of it's not really a radical. It's on the one hand, it's a very modest, moderate proposal.
Right.
You're not calling for unilateral disarmament. You're not calling for total nuclear abolition.
It's literally just the Soviet Union and the United States agreeing to stop building this shit for a while. Yeah.
We're going to pause, and then we're going to figure out how do we start building down from here.
Right.
We're not asking, the United States to just completely stop the arms race. We're asking you guys to pause this thing, both of you. But they kind of get trapped into this thing. If they're going to hang on to this, what do you do about the Euro missiles? Because the Reagan administration has this deadline. They're going to deploy these missiles by 1983. And so if you are going to call for the Reagan administration to unilaterally halt deploying these missiles, well, then you're kind of getting away from this whole bilateral thing. So the freeze is really kind of struggling with this question internally because, of course, they don't want to have these missiles deployed. But on the other hand, you have the MX missile that the Reagan administration is trying to build. You've got a B-1 bomber that the administration is trying to build. There are other weapons out there. And the freeze is trying to think about all these weapons versus European anti-nuclear movement is much more concerned with the Euro missiles. It's a bigger issue for Europe. It's not, and listen, you see this in the Congress too. Why doesn't the Congress do something about this? Well, one congressman puts it very bluntly, this is an issue for Europe, not for us.
Interesting.
So it's not really seen as an American political issue. There's not a lot of weight in the American public about this, American political culture about that. It's more about, can we get a freeze on the arms race? Can we get Reagan to talk to the Soviet Union again? Because Reagan hasn't even been talking to the Soviet Union throughout his first term. It's only like 1984.
Is it accurate to say that the energy sort of does fizzle in some ways? In other words, like it's sort of like as we move along in time, and the situation becomes more complex, the sort of like it almost makes me feel like that idea that you just put out, which I'm going to be thinking about for a while, is that like a mile wide and inch deep thing is sort of like how powerful and committed is this movement really? I feel the same way about Black Lives Matter or Me Too, etc. And it's an open question to me, is kind of like how pervasive is this feeling and how committed is this movement?
You know, I have this quote from E.P. Thompson in my book. And E.P. Thompson is involved in the anti-nuclear movement in Europe. So he says in like when one of his writings, or maybe it was a speech that he was giving. Now that I think about this, he said in a speech that social movements only have a lifespan of say like 3 to 5 years, and if they don't make an impact in that 3 to 5 years, they're basically going to fizzle out. And that's kind of what's happening. Like the nuclear freeze movement is becoming kind of more and more entwined with the Democrats. It's being seen like you get in 1984, you get a political action committee called Freeze Voter 84. And that's kind of being seen as kind of not, they're kind of alienating a lot of like the Republicans who are behind a nuclear freeze too, because they're only supporting Democrats. Even if you were like, say, like I mentioned earlier, a guy named Silvio Conti out of Massachusetts, a Republican who had initially supported the nuclear freeze movement. Well, Freeze Voter 84 was supporting his opponent because he was a Democrat.
Right.
And Freeze Voter 84 had also kind of alienated some of the people from Oregon who were part of Hatfield's campaign because they wouldn't take a position on whether to endorse Hatfield or whether to endorse his opponent, the Democrat. So it becomes kind of increasingly seen as not necessarily a grassroots movement. It starts to become seen as more like this partisan issue, that this is how you can score points on Reagan. You can say you're for a nuclear freeze. And even in the Congress, as I get into in the book, they really, by 1983, even though you have more Democrats in the Congress, you get legislation that's being like totally watered down about the nuclear freeze. It lacks really like the power that the movement wanted from that legislation. And even so to the point where like Leon Panetta goes out and he says something along the lines of, whether or not you're a Democrat or a Republican, you can go back home to your district and you can say whatever you want to your constituents about this thing. It's like a blasé piece of legislation.
Wow.
So,
That's so incredible to think of how quickly that moves and how to me, the irony of like the end of the Cold War being this thing that Reagan is celebrated for as like de-escalating and as, going to have a friendly relationship with Gorbachev and telling him, sternly, you tear down this wall and all that sort of thing. In other words, he becomes like a hero of like almost like a peace sort of achievement. And that, to me, there's a deep irony in that because it seems like it was, for a moment there, he's trying to survive it.
Yeah. I mean, really, they changed Reagan. I mean, this is an image thing. You change the perception of the Reagan administration. You change the whole argument. You say, well, now that we've put these INF missiles in Western Germany, well, now the conversation has shifted. Now we're no longer behind in the arms race. Right. Now that's and you see this too. If you read that last chapter, I talk about this. The onus gets placed on the Soviet Union to come back to the bargaining table now. Reagan, hey, this is 1984. Oh yeah, I'm wide open to talk to you guys. Just say the word, and we'll begin negotiating again as soon as you're ready. Not when I'm ready now. It's up to the Soviets to make these moves. And of course, this is an election year, so the Soviets know that, and they aren't going to do anything to try to help Ronald Reagan win re-election in 1984. Wow. But I wanted to mention Gorbachev again too, because we didn't really get to chat about Gorbachev a bit. Gorbachev comes in 1985, and as I mentioned before, I think there's a lot to say about Gorbachev. I don't think historians are wrong to point to Gorbachev as being an important, crucial figure in the Cold War, but we don't talk a lot about like Gorbachev's influences. And Gorbachev, some of his plans, like some of the things that he's advocating, are things that were directly coming from the nuclear freeze movement. He's talking about, like putting a freeze to the testing of nuclear weapons. He's even like some of his speeches. There was an interview. Larry Whitner great historian Larry Whitner, wrote 3 volumes about the anti-nuclear movement towards nuclear abolition. Larry gave me all of his interview transcripts for like Reagan administration officials and some of the activists who he had talked to.
Awesome.
Yeah, and so one of these activists from Europe had it on authority from somebody who was a speechwriter from Mikhail Gorbachev that they were secretly putting in, like passages from I want to say it was one of the anti-nuclear organizations in Europe. It might have been a campaign for nuclear disarmament, or it might have been one of the other organizations. But they were taking passages from these
like they're listening. Isn't that incredible? Like they are listening
into his speeches. Yeah. So
was that shocking to Reagan?
Being influenced by all this.
Was it shocking to Reagan to find that influence had reached Gorbachev? Was it shocking for him to find out that
I don't know if Reagan knew that this is where Gorbachev was getting some of his ideas from. I mean, the story that you always hear is, okay, Gorbachev comes in, he's wearing these nice suits now. Suddenly he's a respectable member who we can bargain with this guy, as Maggie Thatcher put it.
Jesus.
But I mean, there's a different moment. The tensions have really started to kind of like ease, but they're still, even though the nuclear freeze movement is really on the decline by 1985, eventually it's going to merge with the older anti-nuclear organization SANE.
Yeah.
And they're going to become they're still around today. It's called Peace Action. It doesn't have, it's more like like an arms control lobby organization. They don't have the same kind of grassroots strength that they had in the early 1980s, but it's still around as Peace Action.
And for those that don't know, I just wanted to make that connection. That SANE is the group that sort of with Dr. Spock and like that in the early 60s, and a lot of this SANE energy bleeds into the New Left and like young people, and that. I mean, it's sort of like, it's really interesting to me to find that like same cycle happening again in the 80s with sort of anti-nuclear movement, because we've talked to a lot of people on this show, talked to a lot of like left people today who are like, oh, my parents were involved in the anti-nuclear movement in the 80s, and that's how I was surrounded by all of this, and that's what led me into being like an anti-imperial activist, or like that was what led me to like being an anti-war activist around Iraq and all that sort of thing. So in other words, the connections are very similar to like the 60s in Vietnam, with the nuclear thing being the thing that sort of like gets people into understanding the terms of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think like if we look at anti-nuclear activism in the broader picture, I think it's actually been very successful. Anti-nuclear activists were the people who were pushing John F. Kennedy for a test ban. They were pushing Eisenhower before that, but they actually got to Kennedy on this thing. There was an article in Diplomatic History about that a few years ago. So you have that aspect.
Yeah,
you had the during the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, in the midst of the Vietnam anti-war movement, you also have like the ABM movement. People are opposed to putting these anti-ballistic missile defenses in their backyard. So you have this kind of like NIMBY thing going on. But that's successful. Like I wrote an article about that a few years back. I think there's a little bit about that in my book too. If you read the introduction, I kind of had to summarize some things. But the anti-nuclear movement of the late 60s, early 70s, pushing back on the anti-ballistic missiles. Definitely, again, we're talking about Richard Nixon and being concerned about public opinion and the way in which he's going to be perceived, stopping these sort of things. Well, that was part of what was driving him to go to the Soviet Union and have detente with those guys. Stop the anti-war movement, stop the anti-ballistic movement, make himself popular in public opinion.
Well, the story you tell in your book is, in a lot of ways, the sequel to the stuff that I wrote about in my book about GI coffee houses, and the sequel to a lot of what we talk about on this show, which is sort of like what happened to the anti-war movement after the 1960s, what happened to that energy. Thank you for coming on. I wonder before we go, I wonder what you think about Don't Look Up, because it does seem like a similar moment in some ways, and yet it's hard to say, obviously, as it's happening. But it's kind of interesting to watch. It's obvious that the filmmakers of Don't Look Up sort of had maybe had the day after in their mind. They want to make that similar sort of impact.
Mm-hmm. I think Don't Look Up strikes me. I've seen a lot of comparisons to like Don't Look Up and was the Al Gore movie An Inconvenient Truth.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think The Day After is actually a better comparison. An Inconvenient Truth, I hate to say this, but I almost forgotten about An Inconvenient Truth.
Who cares?
I mean, Al Gore talking about Michael Mann's hockey stick. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, The Day, I mean, they're different kinds of movies. And, like you look at The Day After and you look at Don't Look Up. And these are movies that they're trying to send a message, but they're also kind of doing it in an entertaining way. And I think that's kind of the key difference between listening to Al Gore and watching like a movie with Matt Damon.
No one wants to pop Inconvenient Truth on at a party. Yeah, it's just it's not binge watching. And yeah, you're right. I mean, Don't Look Up is definitely an attempt to they're bringing in Leonardo DiCaprio. I mean, it's interesting actually because DiCaprio did one of those.
DiCaprio's what I meant, not Matt Damon.
Yeah, right. But I mean, Matt Damon is sort of in that category too. I feel like I guess he's pro crypto now though. So that's a different story, but yeah, Leo did an actual one of those boring documentaries. And I say boring, I mean it's a really fascinating movie, but it's just not the same. It's not Don't Look Up. It's not packaged the same way. I wonder about that a lot. It's interesting that The Day After is probably not that great a movie, and yet we talk about it as having this impact.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at The Day After, there were even some criticisms from at the time, there were critics from the nuclear freeze movement who were saying, well, okay, you're bringing the message home about the dangers of nuclear war, but what are we doing about this? There's sort of like with Don't Look Up. It's an entertaining movie, but what's the message? What's the takeaway? How do we stop this comet from coming? In the end, the spoiler alert, the comet hits the hits the world. Just like in The Day After, spoiler alert, there's a nuclear war that occurs. They don't stop this thing from happening. But in a sense, I think this is sort of the way in which you make an action film. You make a film in which people are talking about. You want to have those sort of explosions, I guess, in a film like that. You're trying to drive home a message about the dangers, whether it's the dangers of ignoring climate change, the slow-moving comet that's coming towards us, and we're too concerned about the midterm elections or whatever this next scandal is to do something. We'll just put this off. Or similar with The Day After. Or you could use the same metaphor of a comet with nuclear war. I think it works with that. I think it works with thinking about the pandemic going on. Mm-hmm. Well, we have to put people back to work, or else the economy is going to suffer. And if they're still sick within 5 days, they can wear a mask at work.
Yeah, right.
I think the metaphor works. I mean, there's been a lot of criticisms about Don't Look Up, but I generally thought, okay, maybe it's a little hokey at times, but it's a good movie. It gets I thought it made the impression about this comet coming, this metaphor about climate change. I thought it hit that.
Yeah, I felt the same way. I think people tend to overthink these things. In terms of what is it actually saying, but one of the things that I think, and it might be a way to end, it's a very Howard Zinn sort of thought. But it's sort of I'm reading your book. To me, these movies that are about apocalypse and are about sort of us losing and not figuring it out, are interesting. But then the other side of it is what would a movie be like that showed the kind of story that you reflect in your book, which is sort of another end of it, which is this idea that people actually did things beyond just fear dying in apocalypse. They actually did things to impact the direction of history. Yeah.
They organized, they put pressure on the government, they rallied public opinion. They got unlikely allies to get behind them and to push the same message. And they pushed it on it, as I say in the book, they pushed this message on a very hardline Republican administration. This wasn't an administration that was friendly to the reception of anti-nuclear discussions. At the beginning of this administration, they said they needed a get well package for the military. And so they had to build up the arms race. Yeah, this was what. Yeah, we're behind in the arms race. We need new weapons. And so, of course, this movement comes and it puts the pressure on them. It's very much it is kind of in that Zinn vein.
Yeah, no, totally. And it gives. I mean, I don't want to use a hokey word like hope or optimism or something like that, but your story gives you something different than just the comet hitting and everyone dying. Yeah. It gives you some example of how people can shift the direction of things, and that's what's to me really inspiring and interesting about it, and also just unknown. I mean, this story I don't think is one that's really firmly in the historiography and ought to be, and I hope it makes its way there. So thank you, Henry Maar. I really appreciate it. I want to say the name of your book one more time, which is called Freeze: The Grassroots Movement to Halt the Arms Race and End the Cold War. I can't recommend it enough. And thanks so much for talking with me.
Oh, hey, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Well, okay, that's going to do it for today's Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank my guest, Henry Maar. Go check out his book. It's called Freeze, The Grassroots Movement to Halt the Arms Race and End the Cold War. I know it is very easy to be cynical and pessimistic. It might even be hip to be cynical and pessimistic, particularly when it comes to like the ordinary person's ability or power to do anything about giant scary things like the military-industrial complex and nuclear war, etc. But, you know, books like Henry's and thinking about what I think about, which is the actions taken by ordinary people during the Vietnam War, you have to have faith that those small actions have an impact. And actually, when you look at the way that history has moved, some of those small actions have been the whole story. So that's the best I can do to inject a little bit of hope into what seems like an increasingly terrifying world situation. But thank you, Henry Maar, and thank you all Nostalgia Trap listeners and subscribers. If you want to subscribe and be part of our team, you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. All sorts of bonus content for our supporters. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.